When Jake stood up at my family's Sunday dinner table and announced that I had something important to share with everyone about my behavior at friend's bachelorette party, I knew my life was about to end in front of the 12 people whose opinions mattered most to me. I could feel my heart racing as Jake explained to my devoutly Catholic family that I'd been struggling with some guilt about something that happened in Vegas, and that I'd asked him to help me find the courage to be completely honest with the people I loved most. The way he presented it made it sound like I'd requested this intervention, like I was the one who wanted to confess my sins in front of my entire extended family during our traditional Sunday gathering. My father, who served as a deacon at St. Mary's and had raised me to believe that honesty and moral behavior were the foundations of a good life, nodded approvingly at Jake's words. My mother, who had been planning our wedding in her mind since Jake and I started dating 2 years ago, looked proud that her future son-in-law was helping me work through whatever was troubling me. My grandmother, who attended daily mass and considered herself the family's moral compass, folded her hands and waited for me to begin what she clearly expected would be a moment of redemption and growth. The worst part was watching Jake's face as he waited for me to speak. He wasn't angry or hurt anymore. He was satisfied, like someone who had solved a difficult puzzle and was about to reveal the solution. He'd planned this revenge for weeks, maybe months, and now he was going to watch me destroy myself in front of the people whose love and respect I valued more than anything else in the world. I'd grown up as the perfect daughter in a family where reputation and moral behavior were everything. My parents had met at a Catholic youth group and had built their entire social life around our parish community. My father's role as a deacon meant that our family was held to higher standards than most, and my mother took pride in telling other church members about her children's accomplishments and good behavior. Throughout high school and college, I'd been the daughter who never caused problems, never stayed out past curfew, never brought home boys who didn't meet my parents' approval. I graduated summa cum laude, got a good job in marketing at a family-oriented company, and started dating Jake, who fit perfectly into our family's vision of what a good Catholic man should be. Jake was everything my parents had prayed for in a future son-in-law. He attended Mass regularly, treated me with obvious respect and affection, had a stable career in accounting, and talked openly about his desire to have a family and raise children in the faith. My mother frequently told her friends that she couldn't have chosen a better man for me if she'd designed him herself. Our relationship had been built on shared values, mutual respect, and a common vision for our future. Jake and I talked about marriage frequently, not in vague terms, but with specific plans about timing, finances, and the kind of life we wanted to build together. He'd already asked my father for permission to marry me, and everyone in the family knew that an engagement was imminent. But 3 weeks ago, everything had changed when I flew to Las Vegas for Sarah's bachelorette party. Sarah had been my college roommate and closest friend, and I was serving as her maid of honor. The weekend was supposed to be a celebration of female friendship and Sarah's upcoming marriage, a chance for her college friends to reconnect and create lasting memories. The first night in Vegas had been exactly what I'd expected. Dinner at an expensive restaurant, cocktails at a rooftop bar, dancing at a club where we felt sophisticated and attractive. I'd texted Jake throughout the evening, sharing photos of our group and describing the fun we were having in terms that would reassure him about the wholesome nature of our activities. But the second night had gone very differently. Sarah's maid of honor duties had included arranging entertainment for the group, and she'd surprised us by hiring a male stripper to perform at our hotel suite. When she'd told me about her plans weeks earlier, I'd felt uncomfortable, but hadn't wanted to seem prudish or judgmental. I'd convinced myself that watching a professional performance was harmless, just a silly tradition that I could laugh about later. The stripper who arrived at our suite was exactly what Sarah had ordered. Young, attractive, muscular, and clearly experienced in making groups of women feel comfortable with increasingly intimate performances. He started with music and dancing, gradually removing his clothing while encouraging audience participation and creating an atmosphere of excitement and transgression. What I hadn't anticipated was how intoxicating it would feel to be in an environment where normal rules didn't apply, where I could behave in ways that would be unthinkable in my regular life. The combination of alcohol, peer pressure, and the excitement of being in Vegas had made me feel liberated from the constraints that usually governed my behavior. When the stripper had singled me out for special attention, calling me to the center of the room and positioning me as the focus of his performance, I'd felt a thrill that was part exhibitionism and part rebellion against the good girl image I'd maintained for so long. Instead of declining gracefully or returning to my seat, I'd embraced the moment and allowed myself to participate fully in what was happening. The kiss that Jake had discovered was just the beginning of what had actually occurred that night. For over an hour, I'd been the star of increasingly intimate interactions, while my friends cheered and recorded everything on their phones. I'd touched and been touched, had danced and grinded and behaved in ways that would have horrified my family and destroyed Jake's trust if he'd witnessed them firsthand. When I returned from Vegas, I'd made the decision to keep the details of the bachelorette party private. I'd told Jake that we'd had dinner, done some gambling, and gone to a few shows, painting a picture of innocent fun that matched his expectations about how his future wife would behave on a girls' trip. The lie had felt justified because I'd convinced myself that what happened in Vegas truly didn't matter in my real life. I loved Jake, I was committed to our relationship, and I had no desire to repeat the behaviour that had felt exciting but ultimately meaningless. I'd chalked up my participation in the stripper show to a combination of alcohol and peer pressure, a momentary lapse in judgment that didn't reflect my true character or values. But Jake had discovered the truth through social media, the way so many secrets are revealed in the digital age. One of Sarah's other bridesmaids had posted a video to her Instagram story without thinking about who might see it. The video had only been live for 24 hours, but that had been long enough for Jake to see it and begin his own investigation into what had really happened during my weekend in Vegas. The Sunday dinner tradition was sacred in our family. Every week, my mother prepared an elaborate meal that brought together multiple generations around our dining room table. These gatherings were celebrations of family unity, occasions for sharing news and maintaining the close relationships that had sustained our family for decades. Jake had participated in dozens of these dinners and understood exactly how important they were to all of us. By choosing this setting for his revelation, Jake ensured that my humiliation would be witnessed by everyone whose opinion mattered most to me. He'd also made it impossible for me to control the narrative or minimize the damage, because he'd positioned himself as the helpful boyfriend who was merely facilitating my own desire to be honest with my family. As I sat at my parents' dining room table, feeling the weight of 12 pairs of eyes waiting for my confession, I made one last desperate attempt to minimize the damage. I admitted to kissing the stripper, but described it as a momentary lapse in judgment, a single mistake that had occurred during a silly party game. I emphasized how drunk I'd been, how pressured I'd felt by the other women, and how immediately regretful I'd been about my behavior. But Jake wasn't going to let me get away with a partial confession. With the same calm satisfaction he'd displayed throughout the evening, he began to add details that I'd conveniently omitted from my story. He mentioned that the interaction had lasted for over an hour, not just a few seconds. He described how I'd been an active participant rather than a reluctant victim. He explained that multiple people had recorded the activities and that I'd appeared to be enjoying myself throughout. My mother's face went pale as Jake provided these additional details. My father's expression shifted from supportive concern to growing horror as he began to understand the true nature of what had occurred. My younger sister Katie, who had always looked up to me as a role model, stared at me with obvious shock and disappointment. Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, announcing that he had documentation of everything I'd done in Vegas. The photos and videos he'd collected painted an undeniable picture of my enthusiastic participation in activities that would horrify my conservative Catholic family. There was no way to explain away the evidence or claim that I'd been an unwilling participant when the visual proof clearly showed me laughing, smiling, and actively engaging with the stripper. The worst evidence was a video that captured me giving the performer money while encouraging him to continue his increasingly intimate performance. The clip showed me clearly enjoying the attention and actively participating in activities that went far beyond a simple kiss. When Jake played this video on his phone for my entire family to see, my grandmother actually gasped and reached for her heart medication. My father, who had never raised his voice to me in my entire life, asked me to explain how the woman in these videos could be the same daughter he'd raised to value modesty and moral behavior. The disappointment in his voice was devastating, but it was the look of complete betrayal in my mother's eyes that made me realize how thoroughly Jake had destroyed everything I'd built with my family. Jake wasn't finished with his presentation. He pulled out printed screenshots of text messages I'd sent to friends while still in Vegas. Messages that described how liberated and excited I'd felt during the experience. These texts proved that my participation had been willing and enthusiastic, not the result of peer pressure or excessive alcohol consumption that I'd claimed. The messages also revealed my thoughts about Jake and our relationship, including complaints about feeling constrained by his expectations and his family's conservative values. I'd written about how refreshing it was to be around people who didn't judge me, how amazing it felt to be desired by someone who saw me as exciting rather than just a good Catholic girl. Reading these messages aloud to my family, Jake systematically destroyed not only my reputation, but also my relationship with the people who had loved and supported me throughout my life. My parents realized that their perfect daughter had been lying to them about her true feelings and desires. My siblings understood that the sister they'd admired had been living a double life that contradicted everything our family stood for. The final piece of Jake's evidence was a timeline he'd constructed showing how I'd lied repeatedly about my activities in Vegas. He'd documented every false statement I'd made, every misleading detail I'd provided, and every opportunity I'd had to tell the truth, but had chosen deception instead. This timeline proved that my dishonesty hadn't been a momentary lapse, but a sustained campaign of lies designed to hide behavior I knew would be unacceptable to my family and boyfriend. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. It destroys everything you've built your identity on. The silence that followed Jake's presentation was the longest few minutes of my life. My family sat in stunned silence, processing the evidence they'd just seen and trying to reconcile the woman in the videos with the daughter and sister they thought they knew. The disappointment and betrayal on their faces was more painful than any anger could have been. My father was the first to speak, asking me if everything Jake had shown them was true. When I nodded, unable to maintain any more lies in the face of overwhelming evidence, he asked me to explain how I could have behaved so differently from the values our family had taught me. The pain in his voice made it clear that my actions had wounded him deeply, not just as a father, but as a man who had built his identity around raising children who honored God and family. My mother's reaction was even more devastating. She began crying quietly, not the tears of anger, but the deep sorrow of a woman whose fundamental beliefs about her daughter had been shattered. She asked me how long I'd been living this double life, whether everything she'd believed about my character had been a lie, and how I could have deceived not just Jake but our entire family for so long. My younger sister Katie, who had always seen me as her role model and guide, asked me why I'd thrown away everything good in my life for a few hours of excitement with a stranger. The hurt in her voice reminded me that my actions had consequences beyond just my own life, that I'd damaged her faith in the family values we'd all been raised to embrace. Even my grandparents, who had always been my strongest supporters and proudest advocates, struggled to understand how their granddaughter could have made such choices. My grandmother, who attended daily mass and had taught me to value purity and modesty above all else, looked at me like she was seeing a stranger wearing her granddaughter's face. Jake observed all of this pain and disappointment with obvious satisfaction. He'd achieved exactly what he'd set out to accomplish. He'd destroyed my relationship with my family by forcing them to see who I really was, underneath the perfect daughter facade I'd maintained for so long. He'd turned the people who loved me most into judges who had no choice but to condemn my behavior. But Jake wasn't finished with his revenge. He announced to my family that he'd been planning to propose to me the following weekend, that he'd already bought a ring and arranged a romantic dinner where he'd intended to ask me to be his wife. He showed them the engagement ring he'd purchased, a beautiful solitaire that represented the future we'd planned together. Then Jake explained that my deception had made it impossible for him to trust me as a life partner. He couldn't marry someone who was capable of lying so convincingly about her character and behavior. He couldn't start a family with someone who had such different values from what she claimed to believe. He couldn't build a life with someone who had proven herself capable of betraying his trust in the most fundamental ways. The engagement ring that should have been a symbol of our future together became another weapon in Jake's arsenal of evidence against me. My parents realized that my actions hadn't just damaged my relationship with Jake, but had cost me the marriage and family that everyone had been anticipating. My behavior in Vegas had destroyed not just my present, but also my future. Jake's final revelation was that he'd already spoken with his priest about the situation and had been advised that my behavior constituted grounds for ending our relationship without any moral obligation to work through our problems. The church's support for his decision gave his actions religious authority that my family couldn't argue against. When you lose your family's respect, your partner's trust, and your community's support all at once, you discover what really matters and what you threw away. The immediate aftermath of Jake's presentation was swift and devastating. My parents asked me to leave their house while they processed what they'd learned and decided how to handle the situation. For the first time in my life, I was being expelled from the family gathering, excluded from the sacred space where we'd shared so many important moments. My siblings and their families left shortly after I did, unable to continue the normal Sunday dinner routine after what they'd witnessed. The tradition that had been the foundation of our family's unity was destroyed, at least temporarily, by the revelation of my deception and betrayal. Jake remained at my parents' house after I left, accepting their apologies for my behavior and their gratitude for his honesty in revealing the truth. My family treated him like the victim he was, offering him support and understanding while I drove home alone to face the consequences of my choices. Over the next several days, I received calls and messages from various family members, each expressing their disappointment and struggling to understand how I could have hidden this side of myself for so long. My parents were particularly hurt by the realization that they'd been planning and dreaming about a wedding that would never happen, a future that had been destroyed by my actions. The news of Jake's revelations spread quickly through our extended family and church community. My aunts and uncles learned about my behavior through phone calls from my parents, who felt obligated to explain why Jake would no longer be attending family events. The story spread through our parish as well, since my father's role as deacon meant that many people were aware of our family's personal lives. The judgment from our church community was swift and harsh. People who had known me since childhood struggled to reconcile the woman in Jake's evidence with the good Catholic girl they thought they knew. Some members of the congregation approached my parents with sympathy for their situation and praise for Jake's moral courage in revealing the truth. My professional life was also affected as the story spread through the networks that connected our small community. My employer, a family-oriented marketing firm that valued moral character in its employees, became aware of the controversy through social connections. While they couldn't fire me based on my personal behavior, the change in how my colleagues and clients viewed me was immediately apparent. The dating prospects in my small town were essentially eliminated overnight. Jake's evidence had been shared widely enough that most single men in our area knew about my behavior in Vegas and my pattern of deception. The conservative values that dominated our community meant that few men would be interested in pursuing a relationship with someone who had such a public scandal attached to her name. Jake, meanwhile, was receiving widespread support and admiration for his handling of the situation. Church members praised him for his integrity in revealing the truth rather than hiding his girlfriend's immoral behavior. My own family members expressed their gratitude to him for showing them who I really was before a marriage could take place. The isolation was immediate and complete. I went from being surrounded by family, friends, and community support to being essentially alone with the consequences of my choices. The people who had been the foundation of my social life and emotional support system had withdrawn their acceptance and approval, leaving me to face the reality of who I was without their enabling and protection. Some mistakes cost you everything, but the real tragedy is when you still don't understand why. My attempts to reconcile with my family over the following months were largely unsuccessful. I attended counselling as they requested, but my therapist's focus on personal responsibility and accountability felt like additional punishment rather than helpful guidance. I struggled to accept that my behaviour in Vegas had been a choice that reflected my character rather than a momentary lapse caused by circumstances beyond my control. I tried to return to church, hoping to find forgiveness and redemption through religious participation, but the experience was humiliating rather than healing. Other parishioners who knew about my scandal treated me with obvious judgment and disapproval. Even the priest who had counselled Jake seemed more interested in using my situation as a cautionary tale than in helping me find a path to forgiveness. My family gradually allowed me back into their lives, but with clear boundaries and diminished trust. I was invited to major holidays and events, but not to the regular Sunday dinners that had been the foundation of our family's unity. My role in family decisions and celebrations was significantly reduced, and my opinions carried much less weight than they had before. My younger sister Katie was particularly affected by my scandal. My parents had used my behaviour as a cautionary tale for her, warning her about the dangers of deception and immoral behaviour. The close relationship we'd shared was damaged by her loss of respect for me and her fear of being associated with my reputation. Jake's integration into my family's life continued even after our relationship ended. He remained close to my parents and siblings, who viewed him as the son they'd never had and the moral exemplar they wished their own daughter could be. Holiday gatherings and family events often included Jake, while my own attendance became less frequent and less welcome. The professional consequences of my behaviour continued to limit my career prospects. While I wasn't formally punished by my employer, the change in how clients and colleagues viewed me was significant enough to affect my advancement opportunities. I eventually left the company to avoid the ongoing discomfort and found work in a different field where my reputation was less well known. My attempts at dating were consistently unsuccessful, as men in our community had heard about my scandal and were unwilling to risk association with someone who had such a public history of deception and inappropriate behaviour. The few relationships I managed to start were casual and short-term, as partners inevitably learned about my past and decided they didn't want to deal with the associated drama. The geographic limitations of living in a small town where everyone knew my story made it difficult to escape the consequences of my actions. Moving to a different area would have required giving up the few family relationships I'd managed to preserve and starting over completely without any support system. My psychological state deteriorated as I struggled to cope with the isolation and ongoing judgment. I developed drinking problems as a way to numb the pain of my social exile and began engaging in increasingly self-destructive behaviours that only reinforced my family's belief that I was fundamentally flawed. The annual cycle of holidays and family events became a constant reminder of what I'd lost and how my actions had affected everyone around me. Each Christmas and Easter brought fresh pain as I observed Jake's continued integration into my family's celebrations, while my own participation remained limited and conditional. The most devastating revenge isn't what someone does to you. It's when they force you to face who you really are in front of everyone who matters most. If this story made you think about the power of truth and the price of deception, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about secrets and consequences. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss what happens when our worst moments define us forever. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who can hurt us most completely when they discover who we really are. What city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments and tell me. Have you ever had a secret that would destroy your life if the wrong person found out?